Break the Line, Part 2, Chapter 12, The Job. Arg sat cross-legged on the Widow's cold deck plating, the emergency lights still throwing dull red glows across the interior. His back rested against the sealed bulkhead of Compartment 2, one of the few areas not actively venting atmosphere or in danger of electrical fire. The Widow still smelled of burnt insulation and overheated coolant. The ship felt like her own kind of wounded animal, restless, angry, but holding on. Arg inserted Chew's data stick into the backup console, bypassing the still-fried primary data relay. A single file appeared on the screen. Priority contract proposal. Asset relocation. Time sensitive. Arg exhaled slowly and opened the file. A brief pause while the Widow's battered core decrypted the contents. Then the job details filled the screen. His eyes narrowed with every new line. First point. The cargo wasn't ore. Wasn't machinery. Wasn't even classified as materials. It was a person. Designated priority passenger, non-corporate. No name listed, just a biometric tag profile and a note. Extraction required from Kovac Station, Level 4 Medical. Secure transit to Outer Belt, non-Helix territory. No questions, non-negotiable. Second point, the timeline. Tight. Too tight. Pickup window 6 hours from now. Transit window before next Helix security rotation at the shift change. Roughly 9 hours total. Third point, payment. Arg scrolled to the bottom, paused, then whistled low. The listed fee was enough to cover Widow's repairs, fuel, and leave enough left over for at least 3 months of solo ops without taking another contract. He sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. Of course, there had to be a catch, and it didn't take long to find it. Final note in the file, passenger extraction flagged as high risk, potential corporate interdiction likely, use of force authorized if necessary. Arg let out a bitter laugh. Of course it is, he muttered. The biometric profile attached to the job didn't list a name or a face, but it did list one important thing. The passenger had a restricted Helix employee ID, which meant whoever this was, they weren't just running from station security. They were running from inside the corporation. Probably someone who knew something they weren't supposed to. Arg's gut tightened. This wasn't a cargo run. This was smuggling. Corporate extraction. Possibly corporate espionage. And with Helix already breathing down his neck, taking this job was like lighting a signal flare and screaming, "Come get me." He sat there in the half-dark, staring at the console screen. 6 hours. That's how long he had to decide. Iona's voice finally crackled through the console speaker, quieter than usual due to the damaged signal processors.
Analysis complete, the AI said. Possibility of successful extraction in transit, 31%.
Great odds, Arg muttered.
Probability of permanent Helix blacklisting if you decline, 88%.
Arg frowned. Wait, why? Iona paused.
Because accepting this contract appears to be the only route by which external contracts are willing to intervene on your behalf. Refusal leaves you with no allies, no leverage.
In other words, Helix had already closed most of the doors. Chew's job offer wasn't really an offer. It was the only exit left. Arg stood, flexing stiff legs, feeling the Widow creak faintly under his boots. He looked towards the forward viewport, where the station's lights glowed faintly through layers of steel and distance. Then he keyed in a short command, dumping the contract file to his personal pad. No turning back now. All right, he said softly. Looks like I've got a passenger to pick up. Next steps were already forming in his head. First, get down to Level 4 Medical without station security flagging his ID scans. Second, find this mystery asset. Third, get them back to the Widow. And then, punch through whatever net Helix threw over the station. He pulled on his jacket, fastened the front, and checked the small concealed tool pouch in the lining, where he still kept the old collapsible impact wrench Tara had given him years ago. Old habits. Never knew when you'd need a blunt object and a little leverage. "Iona," he said as he stepped towards the airlock. "Prep internal systems. If we're doing this, we're gonna need every ounce of power you can squeeze out of her."
Understood,
The AI voice answered, her voice crackling like distant radio static. Arg gave one last look at the widow's battered console, then stepped out onto the station's main corridor, heading towards trouble like an old friend he never quite stopped knowing. Chapter 13. Level 4. Medical. The corridor down to Level 4 wasn't made for stealth. Harsh overhead fluorescence, wide walkways designed for gurneys and evac stretchers. Multiple choke points where station security liked to loiter, coffee in one hand, sidearm on the hip. Arg moved fast, but casual. Jacket zipped high, head down, hands buried deep in his pocket like any other miner just trying to shake off a rough docking. Iona's voice crackled softly in his ear, the audio gain dialed low enough that no one nearby could hear.
Station network reports 3 security teams currently posted between your location and Level 4. 2 roving, 1 static checkpoint.
Arg muttered under his breath. "Status on camera coverage."
Partial. Several units offline for maintenance. I have injected minor loop delays into active feeds near Corridor 7B, but visual masking remains incomplete.
In other words, she bought him a few blind spots, but not invisibility. "Got it," he said, already adjusting his route. Level 3 was where the first checkpoint sat. 2 guards and a biometric scanner built into the wall next to the lift hub. The line of people waiting to pass was slow, bored, and mostly made up of cargo runners and station maintenance techs heading between shifts. Arg joined the back of the queue, keeping his head low, mentally rehearsing half a dozen bad cover stories in case he got flagged. A maintenance drone rolled past on cracked treads, dragging a coolant leak behind it like a lazy mechanical snail. 2 kids from the repair crews laughed and pointed. The guard by the scanner didn't look up. Good. The line shuffled forward. Arg edged closer. One more person ahead of him. Then it was his turn. The scanner pulsed red as he stepped up, requesting ID confirmation. Arg slid a chipped ID card across the sensor. Old. Forged. But passable for lower-level clearance. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than he liked. His pulse quickened. Then the light blinked green. "Proceed," the guard said without even glancing at him. Arg didn't wait to celebrate. He moved quickly past the checkpoint, turning left towards the secondary lift shaft. The ride down to Level 4 felt like forever. The lift's cracked speakers hummed with station announcements. "Helix Corps thanks you for your cooperation during routine security operations. Please report any suspicious behavior to the nearest station official." Arg leaned against the wall, pretending to study the floor readout. His mind was already working ahead. Level 4 was mostly medical bays and overflow quarantine wards, which meant cameras, more guards, and nowhere to hide once he stepped off the lift. Iona buzzed in again.
New update. Security activity increasing on Level 4. Additional patrol units deployed to main corridor junctions. Passenger location still showing as Bay 4C, but signal interference is increasing.
Arg frowned. "Someone jamming your link?"
Possibly, or passenger is carrying an active signal scrambler.
Either way, this just got harder. The lift doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. Cooler air hit him immediately. Level 4 ran colder. The environmental controls always set low to help with med storage and infection protocols. The lighting here was different too. Soft, almost clinical. The corridors gleamed in pale blues and whites, and the smell of disinfectant hung thick. Arg moved fast, kept left, avoided eye contact with nurses walking between bays. More than once, he ducked into side alcoves as station security passed. Every time he paused, his heartbeat ticked faster, half expecting to shout behind him, the thud of boots running his way. But luck, for now, stayed on his side. Bay 4C was on the far end of the level, tucked near the old quarantine block, a section they rarely use these days, unless something sensitive needed privacy. Arg reached the final corner and paused, back pressed to the wall. Iona whispered in his ear,
One stationary guard posted outside 4C. No others in immediate proximity.
Arg risked a glance. Sure enough, a single Helix security contractor stood at the bay door, rifle slung but ready, posture loose but trained. Young, maybe mid-20s, helmet off, already bored with his assignment. Arg weighed his options. Fight? Not here. Too loud. Sneak past? Not a chance. Not with the guy planted right at the door. That left distraction. Arg's gaze shifted across the hallway. A maintenance access panel sat 5 meters down, half open with exposed wiring, hanging loose from some recent repair work. Perfect. Arg moved quickly. He popped the access panel fully open and pulled a small multi-tool from his jacket lining. One twist of wire, a bypass across the relay nodes. And with a hiss, the overhead lights flickered and went dark, just long enough to trigger a cascade of low-level alarm pings across the maintenance grid. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, faint and patchy at best. The guard swore under his breath, tapping his comms. Ops Control, this is Post Charlie 7. Power just blinked out on my grid. Any maintenance crews inbound? Arg didn't wait for the answer. He crossed the distance fast, silent. One quick strike to the back of the guy's knee, dropping him, followed by a sharp elbow to the side of the head that left the contractor unconscious before he could finish yelling. Arg dragged the limp body behind a nearby supply cart, then keyed open the door to Bay 4C. The room was dark, colder than the hall. For a split second, Arg wondered if maybe Chew's intel was bad. Then something moved near the far wall. A figure, half sitting, half leaning against the medbay console. Thin, human, short cropped hair. Wearing a Helix Tech uniform, but stripped of its ID badges and rank markings. Their face toward him, narrow, sharp-eyed. Early 30s, maybe. Arg's gut tightened. Not what he expected. The person stood, wobbling slightly, but catching themselves against the console. You're late, they said, voice dry but steady. Arg blinked. You're the package? The person smirked faintly. You expecting a crate of ore? Arg opened his mouth for a smart reply, but didn't get the chance. Behind him, the station alarm klaxon started to wail. Red lights strobed across the corridor. Iona's voice screamed in his ear. Warning, Helix security lockdown in progress. All decks, immediate response teams en route to your location. Arg's heart jumped. Perfect timing, he muttered, then grabbed the passenger's arm. Let's go. Together, they bolted from the med bay, running full tilt towards whatever bad idea Arg could come up with next. Chapter 14. Run for the Widow. The station alarm was deafening. Every corridor on level 4 erupted with flashing red strobes and a low pulsing klaxon that rattled the metal walls. Arg shoved the passenger ahead of him, keeping low as they sprinted past the downed guard. Behind them, distant voices shouted over comms and PA speakers. Security breach in med level. All available teams converge on section 4C. Lockdown protocols engaging on decks 3 through 5. Arg's breath burned in his lungs, but he didn't slow down. We've got about 90 seconds before they seal the main lift shaft. Iona's voice crackled urgently in his ear. Then we're not using the lift, Arg growled, ducking around a corner and nearly colliding with a cargo bot, trundling the opposite direction. The passenger struggled to keep up, half lipping on what looked like an injured ankle, but they didn't complain. Didn't ask questions, just ran. Smart. Arg led them down a maintenance access corridor he'd used once before, back when he needed to bypass customs after a bad or manifest mix-up. A tight, narrow crawl space that ran behind Deck 4's cooling conduit. It smelled like hot metal and stagnant air, but it would bypass the primary scanner checkpoints. They climbed inside one after the other, Arg pulling the hatch closed behind him. The space was barely wide enough for him to crawl on hands and knees. Sweat dripped down his face as he scrambled forward, glancing over his shoulder every few meters to make sure the passenger was still close. Where the hell are you taking me? The passenger finally gasped, crawling behind him. Back to my ship. Your ship's locked. Yeah, working on that. The crawl space ended near a gravity rebalancer junction on Deck 3. Arg pried the exit panel open with both hands, wedging it aside just enough for them to squeeze through. Iona pinged his comm again.
Security teams now sweeping Deck 3 main halls. 2 squads moving toward docking ring B.
Of course they are, Arg muttered, wiping grease off his palm and helping the passenger climb out. He paused for half a second, studying them in the dim light. Sweat on their foreheads, a slight tremor in their hands. They were scared, but holding it together. Name? Arg asked. The passenger hesitated. Then, Rel. All right, Rel. Stay close and don't argue. They moved fast, hugging the wall of the maintenance corridor. Arg kept track of patrol patterns by ear, listening for the metallic stomp of security boots echoing down the bulkheads. Twice they had to double back. Once they ducked behind a storage rack just as a 2-man patrol rounded the corner. Arg's heart pounded as he held his breath, watching the guards pass less than 2 meters away. Rel crouched beside him, hands balled into tight fists. When the corridor cleared, they moved again. By the time they reached docking ring B, Arg's shirt was plastered to his back with sweat. The air smelled like ozone and coolant. Station security had deployed portable barricades across the main hall, a checkpoint locking down all access to the docking base. 7 guards, full tactical loadouts, stun rifles, combat visors. Iona chimed softly.
Secondary airlock maintenance tunnel remains unmonitored. Distance 40 meters east behind service hatch G12.
Arg's eyes narrowed. The maintenance tunnel led directly into the underside of the Widow's docking cradle, normally used for repair crews. Unshielded. Not safe, but better than running straight into armed security. He motioned to Rel. Time for a shortcut. They slipped back behind the nearest cargo crate, then moved fast and low towards the maintenance hatch. Arg popped the manual override with a cracked utility key and wrenched the panel open. He shoved Rel inside first, then followed, sealing the hatch behind him. The tunnel was barely more than a crawl space, thick with humidity and lined with coolant pipes. Every few meters, a loose coupling hissed out bursts of hot air. Almost there, Arg grunted, dragging himself forward. At the far end, a faded maintenance ladder led up towards the access hatch beneath Bay 12, where the Dust Widow waited, still sealed, but within reach. Arg climbed first, pushing open the upper hatch just enough to peer into the docking cradle. No guards here. Yet. Iona's voice crackled again.
Security has issued a full station lockdown. I've initiated emergency system override, but departure clamps remain physically engaged.
Arg gritted his teeth. Can you get me power?
Auxiliary startup complete. Minimal thrust capacity available. Weapons offline.
Don't care about weapons, just prep for launch. He pulled himself up through the hatch, then reached back and grabbed Rel's hand, hauling them into the deck of the Widow's underside maintenance bay. Rel scrambled after him, face pale but determined. Arg led them both toward the ship's main airlock, bypassing the exterior access with a manual code override. The door hiss opened. They tumbled inside just as Iona sealed the bulkhead behind him. Arg slapped the comm panel. Disengage lockdown safeties, reroute power to maneuvering thrusters.
Warning, Iona replied. Docking clamps remain locked. External control override required to disengage physical restraints.
Arg's fist slammed down on the console. Then blow the damn clamps!
Processing manual override sequence. Stand by.
Lights flickered across the Widow's control banks. Outside, distant alarms shifted pitch as dockside systems registered Arg's growing power signature. The Widow was waking up, battered, half broken, but still mean enough to fight. Arg dropped into the pilot's chair, hands already flying across the controls. Rel, strap in and hold on. The passenger buckled themselves into the crash seat behind him without argument. Arg's heart pounded as the Widow's engines began to spool. Docking clamps strained, metal groaned. As the station's security teams converged on his position, Arg keyed in one final command. Let's punch a hole through this station. With a shudder and roar, the Dust Widow lurched against her restraints, gearing up for one more impossible escape. Chapter 15. Breaking Free. The Dust Widow shuddered like a wounded animal as Arg pushed her engines past the red line. Warning lights flooded the cockpit in angry waves of orange and red. Structural stress limit exceeded. Dock clamp tensions critical. Thruster alignment unstable. Iona's voice cut through the chaos, her tone calm but edged with mechanical urgency.
Docking clamps remain engaged. Hydraulic restraints at 62% load capacity. Current thrust will cause frame shear in 23 seconds.
Arg gritted his teeth, both hands locked around the primary throttle. Shear it, then. He slammed the override, feeding every last available joule of power into the forward repulsors. The Widow's engines howled in protest. Behind him, Roe was strapped into the rear crash seat, gripping the harness with white-knuckled hands, eyes wide but silent. Smart. At this point, there wasn't time for screaming. Arg's fingers flew across the manual release panel, bypassing the last of the safety interlocks. Iona, cut atmospheric seals on external docking collar. Vent the maintenance ring.
Warning, this will cause explosive decompression in docking ring B.
Yeah, Arg muttered. That's the idea. The Widow's exterior venting charges fired with a muffled thud. For a split second, everything around them went still. Then the universe jerked sideways. Metal shrieked as the Widow tore herself free from the station's clamp, ripping the docking collar in half with her. Alarms from the station lit up the external comm frequencies. Unauthorized launch, sector breach, all units intercept immediately. Deploy drone interceptors and lock down egress lanes. The ship lurched hard, throwing Arg sideways in his seat before the inertial dampeners caught up. He snapped the Widow into a steep banking roll, pushed her out of the direct firing lane of the nearest defensive battery. Twin bursts of flak exploded off their port side, station guns waking up late but angry. Shields, he barked. Iona's reply was grim.
Shield emitters at 17%. Recharge rate negligible.
So, practically no shields left at all. Perfect. Arg pulled the flight stick hard, driving towards the shadow line cast by the station's own superstructure. If he could stay low, close enough to confuse their targeting solutions, he might buy a few seconds before the next salvo. But he wouldn't get far. Not without speed. Give me everything you got in the engines, he shouted.
Diverting non-essential systems, Iona replied. Routing coolant flow? Warning, core temperatures rising.
Ahead, the black void of open space beckoned. A promise. A threat. Probably both. But between him and freedom, 3 Helix defense drones were already vectoring in on intercept paths. Arg's targeting HUD flared with proximity wardings. 3 contacts. Full armament. Missile locks pending. Rel's voice came from behind. Tight. Strained. What happens if they catch us? Arg didn't answer. Instead, he threw the Widow into a barrel roll, cutting thrust for half a second to let the pursuing drones overshoot. 2 of them took the bait. The third stayed on him, adjusting its pursuit vector with cold and machine precision. Missile lock alarms blared. Arg slapped the emergency ECM toggle. Come on, come on. A burst of static washed through the cockpit as the Widow's jury-rigged countermeasures fired an overloaded EM pulse designed more for mining sensor disruption than combat. But for one precious second, the targeting lock flickered. Arg punched the throttle. The Widow surged forward, engines screaming like tortured lungs. Plasma flared along the outer hull as the closest drone opened fire. A stream of kinetic rounds ripped across the Widow's rear quarter. Panels bucked. Warning systems lit up like fireworks. Iona, damage report!
Aft plating compromised. Portside reaction control thrusters at 42%. Hull integrity declining.
Arg grimaced. Not great, but still flying. For now. He pushed the Widow into a spiraling climb, breaking free of the station's shadow and pulling hard for the outer approach corridor, what pilots called the Black Lane. A narrow egress channel barely wider than the Widow's wingspan, originally designed for supply shuttles and maintenance tugs. Too tight for Helix's larger gunships to follow. If he could reach it before the drones got another firing solution, Iona, plot me a direct line to the black lane. Fastest burn we've got left.
Calculating.
The HUD flared. Arg pushed the ship harder. Thrusters strained. Core temperatures edged into critical. Behind him, Rel clung to his seat harness, face pale, but eyes sharp, watching the display. Another missile lock warning screamed across the console. Too late to dodge this one. Arg grabbed the flight stick and rolled the Widow into her side, exposing her damaged flank. Better the already ruined plating than losing the whole ship. The missile struck with a brutal impact. The ship kicked sideways like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. Arg's head snapped back against the seat. Panels blew out along the port side wall. Sparks rained across the cockpit. Iona's voice dropped into a distorted, barely audible growl.
Structural integrity, 12%. Life support, fluctuating.
Arg blinked hard, shaking off the impact. Hands back on the controls. Eyes on the HUD. The black lane was dead ahead, just 2 clicks out. One more push. Just one. Hold together, girl, he whispered to the ship. His ship. His last friend out here. Come on. Engines roared as he dumped everything. Maneuvering thrusters, reserve battery power, even drawing off the emergency life support grid for one final burst of acceleration. The Widow surged forward, trailing smoke and leaking vapor. The pursuing drones adjusted course, but they were seconds too late. Arg hit the lane entrance at full burn. Metal screamed as the ship scraped both walls on the way through, but she didn't stop. Didn't break. Didn't die. The external proximity alarms flared again, then faded as the Widow cleared the station's engagement ring. Arg slumped back in his seat. The Widow bucked and groaned under him, but she was still moving, still flying. The black lanes spat them out into open space, stars widening ahead like a door he thought would stay shut forever. Behind them, station control barked out more warnings. Too late to matter now. Arg keyed off the emergency power feeds. Let the ship coast. Silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the crackle of damaged speakers and the faint hum of still cooling thrusters. After a long pause, Rel spoke from the crash sheet.
That was insane.
Arg gave a tired, cracked laugh. Yeah, he said. It usually is. He glanced over his shoulder, catching Rel's wide-eyed stare. Hope you're worth it. Rel didn't answer. Didn't need to. Arg already knew. This was just the start of a much bigger mess. Chapter 16. Out in the black. The Dust Widow drifted through the dark like a wounded predator trying to vanish into deep water. Her engine stayed cold. Her transponder stayed silent. Arg kept her on a dead drift for nearly 30 minutes before daring to power up even the lowest range navigation pings. The belt loomed ahead. Endless scatter fields of rock, ice, and old mining routes forgotten by most of civilized space. Perfect cover, if you knew how to use it. Arg did. But even he knew how thin the odds were this time. Iona's voice crackled from the half-functional speaker above the console.
Multiple Helix patrol craft now vectoring out from the station. Estimated net spread covers 75 click radius. Search patterns expanding.
Arg rubbed a hand across his face, feeling days of stubble and dried sweat. How long until they sweep this sector?
At current expansion rate, less than 20 minutes.
Arg cursed under his breath. He reached down and powered up one of the Widow's low-frequency directional thrusters, nudging the ship deeper into the nearest asteroid cluster. Not much, just enough to let their drift line carry them out of the predicted search grid. Running silent had its limits. Sooner or later, they'd have to fire engines for real. But for now, drift and pray. Behind him, Rel sat cross-legged on the secondary crew bench, wrapping a torn strip of fabric around their bruised ankle. Their hair was matted with sweat, and their gray station uniform looked like it had been slept in for a week. Mind telling me who you actually are yet? Arg asked without turning around. Rel didn't answer at first. just tightened the makeshift raft on their leg, winced, then looked up.
Someone Helix wants bad enough to kill for, they said.
Yeah, got that part.
Arg glanced at them over his shoulder.
What I want to know is why I'm risking my ship and my life for you.
Rel smirked, but it didn't reach their eyes. Guess you should have read the fine print on that contract.
Arg let out a dry, bitter laugh. Story of my life.
The ship rattled slightly as it passed through a thin debris cloud, fine particulate from some ancient collision long before either of them was born. The Widow's external hull sensors struggled to compensate, her system still half fried from the station escape. Arg watched the navigation screen flicker and stabilize, showing him nothing but static-filled asteroid scatter fields in every direction. Good. That's what he wanted. Noise. Confusion. Places to hide. He tapped the console.
Iona, options?
Running predictive search models, the IR replied. Best case scenario? Hold current drift path for another 6 minutes, then initiate low-powered lateral thrust to alter trajectory. Recommended targeting nearby debris cluster sector Delta 87.
Arg checked the map overlay. Delta 87 was a stretch of low-density rubble about 3 clicks out. Not ideal cover, but better than empty space. He nodded. Do it.
Programmed.
The Widow maneuvering thrusters hissed softly, bury a whisper of movement. Just enough to push them sideways, nudging their course out of the projected search pattern. Arg stayed glued to the sensor screen, watching, waiting. Every ping from Iona's passive scanners showed more Helix ships spreading like a slow net behind them. Too many. Too fast.
Helix just broadcasted a priority alert to all belt stations within 1 AU, Iona added.
Arg's stomach dropped. Say that again?
New transmission on open channels. Repeating message. All ports advised to deny docking, fueling, or resupply services to vessel ID Dust Widow. Full enforcement authority granted to Helix security contractors operating in outer sectors. Active pursuit status confirmed.
Arg closed his eyes, just for a second. The final door had slammed shut. No station would touch him now. Not for docking, not for repairs, not for fuel. He was officially burned. Blacklisted. A non-entity. Rel must have picked up on the shift in his posture because they stood, hobbling over despite the limp, and leaned against the co-pilot's chair. That bad, huh? Arg let out a hollow laugh. Let's just say I won't be making port at Helix stations anytime this century. Rel stayed quiet for a beat. Then,
Sorry.
Arg shot him a look. Are you? Rel's expression darkened.
I didn't ask for any of this. You think I wanted to be stuck in that med bay waiting for some half-mad miner to pull me out under fire?
Then why were you there? Arg snapped.
Rel hesitated, then said low. Because I had information Helix didn't want me to have. And when I tried to walk out with it, they locked me down.
Arg stiffened. What kind of information? Rel glanced at the damaged console screens, then back at Arg.
The kind that changes everything.
Before Arg could press further, Iona's voice cut through the tension.
New contact, frigate class, vectoring fast from station origin point. Estimated time to intercept, 4 minutes.
Arg swore and kicked the console hard enough to leave a dent. They didn't have time for 20 questions. They didn't have time for arguments. Didn't even have time for anger. He slapped the controls and powered up the main drives. All hands, brace for acceleration, he called, mostly for Rel's benefit. The Widow shuddered as her engines kicked from idle to burn. It wasn't clean, it wasn't elegant, but it was movement. Arg threw her into a sharp dive, skimming the edges of the debris field, threading between rocks the size of cargo containers. Iona piped up, still crackling from damaged systems.
Warning, hull integrity critical, maneuvering beyond safe tolerances.
Put it on my tab, Arg muttered. The view ahead twisted as he spun the ship again, forcing their pursuit vector low down into a denser asteroid packet. Chunks of rock scraped the hull. Metal screech. The widow held. Barely. Rel clung to the seat harness behind him, their face pale but set. When Arg glanced back, their expression wasn't fear anymore. It was something colder. Focused. Like they'd done this before. Arg pushed the widow harder, diving deeper into the belt's broken dark. Running blind. Running hot. Running out of options. But not done. Not yet. Chapter 17. Belt Ghost. The belt swallowed them. Rock shadows stretched in every direction, uneven, drifting massive and ancient. Churned by eons of micro-impacts and solar drift. The asteroid cluster that Arg threaded through was dense enough to scatter sensors, but loose enough to still be navigable, if you knew how. Arg did. This wasn't a mapped shipping lane or a corporate mining corridor. This was off-chart, raw belt, where flight control grids got glitchy and autopilots got stupid, where you either flew by instinct or you didn't fly at all. The Dust Widow slid through the narrow gaps between tumbling rocks, her damaged thrusters coughing with every correction burn. On the main console, half the nav readouts were still dark, or worse, feeding him garbage data. Arg flew mostly by dead reckoning now. Years of belt work had burned the feel of drift and relative velocity into his bones. Every time the ship rolled, he adjusted by instinct. Every time a chunk of rock twisted towards them, he dipped low or climbed, riding microcurrents of debris flow like a deep-sea fish weaving through coral. Behind him, Rel held tight to a support strut, both hands locked, white-knuckled around the cold steel. Their face stayed pale, but their eyes stayed open. Watching him, alerting him. Arg didn't have the patience for conversation. Not now. Not with the widow bleeding coolant and his core temperature skating dangerously close to meltdown. "Iona," he grunted. "Status on Helix pursuit."
Frigate class still closing, the AI replied. Her voice crackled, half distortion, half fatigue from burned-out vocal processors. However, their sensor locks have degraded by 48%. Debris interference remains high.
Arg allowed himself a thin smile. "Good. Let's make it worse." He flipped the stabilizers off and let the widow drift, engines dead cold, inertia carrying him deeper into the asteroid field. It was a dangerous move. No active thrusters meant no correction burns if they drifted too close to collision. But it also meant their heat signature dropped to near nothing. Just another cold rock floating in the dark. 10 minutes crawled past. Then 20. Still no pursuit fire. No new lock warnings. Nothing but the occasional tremor of distant micro-impacts shaking loose dust from the widow's hull. Arg kept one hand on the emergency burn lever. Waiting. Listening. Breathing shallow. Finally, Iona spoke again.
Helix pursuit craft are shifting search patterns. They appear to have lost direct contact.
Arg let out a slow, shaky breath. His heart still hammered in his chest. His ribs ached from where the harness had slammed him during their last evasion burn. But they were alive. For now. He sat back in the pilot's chair, letting his muscles unclench one at a time. Rel let out a long, low exhale from behind him.
"So," they said after a long pause, "that's what it looks like when a miner ghosts a frigate."
Arg barked out a tired, bitter laugh. "Welcome to the belt," he said. Then he stood, stretching stiff legs, and crossed to the secondary system panel. The widow needed triage. Bad. Coolant lines leaking, life support cycling low, power distribution fractured across 3 circuits, hull stress readings deep in the red. Iona displayed the repair queue on the cracked auxiliary screen. Too many problems, not enough time or resources to fix them all. Arg ran a hand through his hair, greasy and damp with sweat. He popped a ration cartridge from the emergency pack and chewed it without tasting, then downed the last of the portable water from the reserve tank. Rel sat on the deck plating now, leaning against the wall, watching him with something between curiosity and calculation.
You always fly like this? They asked.
Only when people like you get me shot at.
Rel smiled faintly. Sorry.
Arg shot them a sidelong look. No, you're not.
A shrug. Maybe not. Silence hung between them. For a long time, Arg said nothing. Just listened to the widow's cooling fans fight to dump heat from the engines. Finally, he asked,
You're carrying data, aren't you?
Rel froze, just for a second. A hesitation so small most people wouldn't have caught it. But Arg wasn't most people. He pointed at them.
That hesitation just told me more than you wanted me to know.
Rel's eyes narrowed. Maybe. Arg sighed, scratched at the stubble on his jaw.
Look, I don't care what you stole or what Helix wants from you. What I do care about is staying alive long enough to drop you off wherever you need to go and putting my ship back together afterwards.
Rel studied him for a moment, weighing something unseen. Then they nodded. I get it. Another pause. Then, you get me to the drop point, and I'll make sure you're paid double what Chew offered. Arg raised an eyebrow.
Double, huh? That's a lot of credits for one passenger.
You'll have earned it. Arg let that hang in the air for a few seconds, and finally stood.
All right, he said. Next priority, hiding long enough to fix the widow and get a nav solution out of this mess.
He keyed the system map, looking for the nearest place to make repairs. A handful of options lit up. None good. All risky. But that was the belt. That was life. Arg punched in a heading.
Hold tight,
he said, sliding back into the pilot seat.
Iona, let's go dark. Full ghost mode.
Understood, the AI said softly. The widow shifted on her axis, coasting deeper into the rock field, running silent, running smart, running scared, but still running. Chapter 18. Ghost Repairs. The Dust Widow hung dead in space, buried inside the cold heart of a drifting asteroid cluster the size of a small moon. No engine burn, no active lights, no external emissions at all. To anyone scanning from the outside, she was just another piece of rock. Silent, cold, invisible. Exactly how Arg wanted it. Inside, it was a different story. The air smelled like scorched wiring and recycled sweat. A thin haze hung near the ceiling from the last overload on the primary power couplings. Arg sat cross-legged on the deck beside the port side access panel, sleeves rolled up, hands deep inside a mess of cracked insulation and half-melted relay nodes. Sparks jumped at his fingertips as he bridged a burnt circuit with a jury-rigged patch wire. Behind him, Iona's voice buzzed low from the wall speaker, still distorted from fried vocal filters. Portside auxiliary power grid restored to 38% nominal output. Arg let out a long, relieved breath.
Better than zero,
he muttered. The repair had taken 3 hours, 3 burned knuckles, and a piece of shielding pulled from the life support conduit that he really shouldn't have touched. But it would hold, for now. He leaned back against the bulkhead, feeling the slow, stubborn pulse of the widow's power core pushing faint heat through the deck plates again. The ship wasn't healthy, but she was breathing. That was enough. For now. From across the cabin, Rel watched him work. They sat on the floor, their back against the cargo restraint rails, ankles still wrapped tight from their injury, but showing less of a limp now. Their station uniform hung loose on their frame, streaked with grease and dust from crawling through every maintenance shaft on their way out of Helix control. For the last few hours, they'd stayed mostly quiet, just observing. But as Arg grabbed for his next tool set, Rel finally spoke. Where'd you learn to patch like that? They asked. Arg didn't look up.
Out here, breaking things is the easy part. Fixing them's how you'll stay alive.
Rel tilted their head. Before the widow, I mean, you weren't always a miner. The question hung in the air longer than Arg liked. For a heartbeat, images of Luna salvage rung, long-haul repair contracts,
and orbital tug jobs drifted through his mind. Even further back, Earthside training in a cramped orbital dockyard, learning to weld in zero-G before he was old enough to shave. But none of that mattered now. Let's just say I've been fixing dying ships longer than I've been flying them. Rel smirked faintly at that, but didn't push. Smart again. Arg respected that. Next priority, cooling system. Without it, the core would overheat the second he pulled for real thrust. Arg climbed up to the narrow maintenance gantry that ran along the Widow's spine, using one hand to brace himself as he pried open the coolant regulation panel. The interior was worse than he feared. 2 cracked intake valves, 1 completely ruptured coolant line, and a fried pump motor that had probably died during the missile impact. He let out a long breath. Gonna need a bypass on the whole port side loop, he muttered. Iona chimed in, still rasping with digital static. Recommended non-standard coolant flow redistributed through secondary reserve lines. Arg grimaced. That'll overload the reserves in what, 10 hours? 9 hours, 32 minutes at current core output levels. He shook his head. Better than nothing. He went to work, stripping, rerouting, bypassing. It was a patch job, a bad one, but it would buy them time. Maybe just enough. An hour later, Arg dropped back into the pilot's seat, wiping grease from his hands with a tattered piece of rags from the maintenance locker. He called up the new power readouts. Better. Still ugly, but functional. The Widow hummed low under his feet, like a half-drunk brawler trying to stand back up. Engine output available at 54% nominal, Iona reported. Not recommended for sustained burn. Noted. Arg cracked his neck and finally turned to Rel. All right, he said. Your turn. Rel blinked. My turn for what? To start telling me what the hell I'm risking my ship for. A long pause. The ship's internal fans hummed softly in the background, straining to vent lingering heat. Finally, Rel let out a slow sigh. Fine, they said. You want answers? Here's the short version. They shifted, sitting up straighter. Helix has been running covert data sweeps for independent miners for the last 6 months. Behavioral profiling, cargo tracking, private communications, even internal ship telemetry, all without consent, all without oversight. Arg stared at them, frowning. That's corporate paranoia 101, he said. Every corps does quiet tracking. Old news. Rel shook their head. This isn't just tracking. They're building predictive aggression models, assigning risk scores to belt pilots, prepping preemptive targeting lists. Arg's stomach tightened. You're saying? Helix is planning a purge, Arg, Rel said, their voice low but sharp. First, the troublemakers. The ones with unpaid liens, smugglers, solo operators like you, then anyone who gets in the way. Arg felt cold creep up in his spine, a memory flickering, Chew warning him not to trust station politics, the sudden rise in patrol activities near the outer clusters, the constant scanning pings near mining lanes that hadn't been there last season. How do you know this? He asked. Because I built half the telemetry scrappers they're using, Rel said bitterly. Then I stole the core data before they could wipe it out. Arg rubbed a hand over his face. Perfect. Just perfect. This is why they locked you in that med bay, he muttered. It wasn't about your health. No, it was about containment. Silence fell again. Arg felt the full weight of it settle across his chest. Running from a bounty was one thing. Running from a corporate data purge, that was something else entirely. Finally, he stood, turning back to the controls. All right, he said. First things first, we need a place to hide, patch this ship for real, and figure out your next move. Rel tilted their head. Our next move. Arg gave them a look. You're on my ship now, he said, then softer. And for better or worse, I don't leave people behind. He punched in a new course vector, deep into the far side of the belt, somewhere quiet, somewhere old. Somewhere Helix wouldn't look, at least not right away. The Dust Widow banked on her new heading. Slow, hurting, but still moving. Still in the fight. For now. Chapter 19. Ashfall Hollow. The Dust Widow limped through the void, trailing thin ribbons of vapor from her wounded coolant lines. Arg kept the burn low, quiet, measured. Every joule of power spent was one more chance for Helix scanners to pick up their trail. Ahead, the asteroid cluster thickened, jagged shadows swallowing the stars. At the heart of it lay their destination, Ashfall Hollow. Arg hadn't thought about this place in years. He first found it back during his second season in the Belt, back when he still believed that hard work and long hours would keep him out of trouble. Ashfall Hollow had been an old, deep miner outpost, abandoned, forgotten, a relic from the first wave of corporate extraction efforts, back when Helix and 3 other now-defunct companies had drilled the belt for everything it had. The outpost sat buried inside the core of a kilometer-wide asteroid, hollowed out by decades of industrial boring and tunneling. No active beacons, no nav pings, no easy way in, unless you knew exactly where to look. Arg did. His fingers danced across the console, feeding the Widow a new approach vector. Iona chimed from the overhead speakers, her voice still scratchy but holding together. Confirming approach. Navigational hazard. Dense particulate debris fields. Recommend microthrust course corrections. Logged, Arg replied. He cut main engines to idle and feathered the maneuvering thrusters, guiding the Widow into a slow drift along the asteroid's termination line, a knife edge where sunlight met shadow. The exterior hull rattled softly as the ship brushed against loose gravel, drifting in the asteroid's wake. Rel stood behind his chair, peering over his shoulder at the display. Where are we? A place I hoped I'd never need to visit again, Arg said. The entrance loomed ahead, a narrow fissure barely wider than the Widow's hull. Dark, unlit, but there, waiting. Arg nudged the ship forward, angling the nose down. The Widow slid between the rock walls with just centimeters to spare. Keep her steady, he muttered. Inside the asteroid swallowed them whole. The void turned pitch black. For 10 long seconds, they flew blind. Then Iona's passive sensors picked up the faint lingering EM signals from old maintenance grid buried deep inside the rock. Emergency glow lines flickered faintly along the tunnel ceiling, half dead, but just enough to trace a path. Rel let out a low whistle. This place gives me the creeps. Good, Arg said. That means it's working. He brought the Widow around her final bend and eased her down into a long disused landing cradle. The ship settled with a groan, metal protesting as the landing struts took her weight. Dust rose from the deck, billowing in slow, lazy clouds. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Arg stood, cracking his back. Welcome to Ashfall Hollow, he said. Population? Us. The airlock hissed as Arg cycled it open. A wave of cold hit him, stale air, tinged with iron and old machine oil. The outpost smelled like a tomb. No lights, no power. Just the slow dripping of condensation somewhere deeper inside. Arg stepped out first, mag boots clicking against the sealed deck. Rel followed, limping slightly but keeping pace. They both carried portable lights. The beams cut thin lines through the dark, illuminated faded hazard stripes and rusted over bulkheads. Old equipment sat where it had been abandoned decades earlier, half-dismantled loader rings, crates of corroded spare parts, cracked oxygen filters, stacked like forgotten relics. This place felt haunted. Arg led them down a narrow maintenance corridor towards the center control node. At one point, his light caught an old graph spray across the wall, barely legible through the grime and the dust. Blood for credits, belt forgotten. Arg's mouth tightened. He remembered hearing stories about the Hollow's final days. A labor dispute gone bad. A lockout that turned violent. Nobody ever came back to clean it up. Nobody ever cared. Perfect place to hide, then. The control room sat buried 2 levels down. Arg pried open the manual panel, then slid into the ancient wiring. It took him nearly 40 minutes to bypass the corroded fuses and coax a trickle of emergency power back online. Flickering overhead lights guttered to life. Old monitors blinked, showing grainy status readouts from ancient systems barely hanging on. Iona's voice piped in from Arg's earpiece as soon as the local uplink synced.
Environmental systems offline. Power grid unstable. Atmospheric conditions breathable, but moisture levels at 17% saturation. Recommend use of ship-based filtration for sustained occupancy.
Not planning on staying long, Arg muttered. He glanced over at Rel, who stood near the doorway, turning a small battered drone casing over in their hands. Pick a bunk room, Arg called to them. Stay inside of perimeter lines. Some of the lower decks flooded back during the last collapse.
Got it.
Rel disappeared into the hall. Arg turned back to the console. First priority, hull repairs. Second priority, fuel reserves. Third priority, figuring out what the hell to do next. He pulled up the Widow's full damage report. It wasn't pretty. Hull breach risk on 2 sectors. Power grid running at 54%. Coolant reserves dangerously low. Engine still compromised. The kind of repairs he needed would take parts he didn't have. Unless he keyed into the old Hollow's inventory system. The database was a mess, half corrupted, dates decades out of sync, but still there. One line caught his eye. Reactor pump spares, lot number C7, storage unit Delta. If the crates were completely rusted through, he might be able to cannibalize enough hardware to bring the Widow's cooling loop back to life. Arg stood, grabbed his tool bag, and headed for the storage levels. As he walked, his comm crackled softly. Iona still riding shotgun on the ship's commnet.
Arg, I'm picking up passive sensor pings at extreme range.
Arg froze. Define extreme.
Rough estimate, 800 clicks out. Spread pattern consistent with Helix drone suite.
Arg closed his eyes. Of course. The clock had already started. Ashfall Hollow might be hidden, but nothing stayed hidden forever. Especially not when you piss off a core with this many resources. He grabbed a hand light and started moving faster down the corridor. Time to work fast, he muttered, and hoped like hell the Widow could fly again before the ghosts outside found them. Chapter 20. Old Bones. The lower storage decks of Ashfall Hollow were colder than the rest of the outpost, not just in temperature, but in feel. Arg felt it the second he stepped through the threshold door. Something about the air down here pressed on the back of his neck, like walls themselves hadn't forgotten what happened all those years ago. His headlamp beam cut across the corridor, illuminating collapsed crates, broken lift tracks, and lengths of cable scattered like spilled intestines across the floor. Rust dust coated everything. Footprints lingered in places, ancient, fossilized impressions in grime where miners had once scrambled for cover or supplies in a hurry. Arg knelt by one set, tracing it with gloved fingers. Too small for a standard loader boot. Too haphazard for someone walking calmly. Running. Probably during the last evacuation, before the lockdown turned bloody. He stood, shouldering his toolkit, and moved deeper. Iona's voice crackled softly in his earpiece.
Radiation levels holding within safe parameters. No active life signs detected within current scan radius. Structural integrity of sublevel remains unstable.
Arg grunted. Story of my life. He ducked through a half-collapsed bulkhead, boots crunching over shattered plas steel. The smell down here was worse. Metal and mold, mixed with that dry, electrical ding of long-dead circuits. Finally, storage unit Delta. He found it tucked into the far corner of the level, its heavy door jammed halfway open, twisted at an angle, where some long-forgotten impact had knocked it off its tracks. Arg pulled a pry bar from his kit and wedged it under the door. It took 3 heaves, a dislocated shoulder pop, and a string of curses before the thing finally ground open wide enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, jackpot. Dozens of crates, stacked floor to ceiling, still sealed under layers of dust and grime. Most bore faded Helix serial codes from at least 2 decades ago. Arg dragged one crate to the floor and cracked it open. Inside, coolant pump assemblies. Outdated? Yes, but intact. Spare filters, hydraulic pressure seals, old but usable. Relief boomed in his chest. Finally, he breathed. He marked the crate and opened a second. This one held reactor flow regulators, some rusted, but a few, still sealed in anti-corrosion wrap, looked serviceable. As he worked, his light fell across the far wall. His movements froze. There, painted in a wide, angry red strokes across the bulkhead. No rescue, no survivors. The letters were faded, but still legible. Arg's throat tightened. Memories stirred. Half-forgotten belt stories told over ration packs and bad recycled coffee. The Ashfall lockout. 70 miners left to starve when Helix cut their oxygen supply. Some had tried to hold out. Some had fought back. None made it out. Arg shook his head, forcing the images away. He turned back to the crates, pushing harder, faster, sorting parts, making piles, trying not to think too long about the bones likely buried deep in the collapsed section of the level. 30 minutes later, he loaded the salvage components into a low-grav utility sled and started hauling them back towards the Widow. As he made his way up the main corridor, Rel's voice came over the comm. "Arg, you might want to hustle." His stomach clenched. "What now?" "Helix drone signatures just pinged on long-range passive. Looks like high-frequency sweep grid. Bouncing signals through nearby rock clusters." Arg swore. "How long?" "Hard to say. Depends on their pattern shift. Could be 10 minutes, could be 20. Arg pushed the sled faster, boots sliding across the loose gravel as he half-jogged down the corridor. Metal rang hollow beneath him with every step. Above, Iona chirped in. "Helix drones deploying adaptive triangulation. Current probability of location detection within the next cycle. 68% and rising." And by the time Arg hit the airlock, sweat dripped down his back. The Widow sat in the cradle, her scarred hull looking worse under the pale deck lights, but still there, still waiting. Rel met him near the ramp. Their face was tense, jaw tight. They pointed at the crate. "That our ticket out?" "Damn well hope so," Arg said, and dragged the parts aboard. Set to work, tools in hand. Focus like a blade. First the reactor pump bypass, then the secondary flow regulators, then the patch seals on the damaged coolant lines. He worked fast, too fast, but there was no choice. Bolts clattered to the floor, fittings half-seated, but the system pressurized without blowing. Good enough. Next, power grid stabilization. He yanked out 3 more burned fuses, jammed in replacements scavenged from the Hollow's own emergency grid. And for 10 terrible seconds after restart, the ship's lights flickered wildly, strobing like the heartbeat of a dying animal. Then, steady. Low power, but steady. Arg climbed back into the cockpit, checking readings. Engine output now hovering at 68%. Coolant flow stabilized. Barely. Weapons still offline. Shields dead. But the Widow could fly. That was all that mattered. Rel dropped into the co-pilot's chair. "Where to now?" Arg's eyes narrowed at the sensor screen. Helix drones were closing, the grid tightening. No time left. "No more hiding," he said. Fingers flew across the controls. "We're burning out of here full thrust. Whatever's waiting outside, we'll punch through." Iona's voice, still rough, but stronger now, spoke from overhead.
Trajectory plotted. Evasive vectors prepared. Recommend immediate launch.
Arg slammed the ignition. The widow roared to life, kicking off the cradle with a shudder that rattled every bolt in her frame. Ashfall Hollow disappeared behind them, swallowed by dust and the rock and old ghosts. Ahead, the belt opened wide. The hunt was back on. But this time, Arg wasn't running scared. Not anymore. The end of Part 2. Void Miner. Break the line.